The only grid you'll be connected to is the one on the bars of your jail cell. Mr. Caldwell, she sneered, her voice a triumphant crackle of static and entitlement over the phone, a sound that seemed to physically press the air out of my workshop. The words hung there for a split second, a perfect crystallization of her petty tyranny, and then the world went silent. It wasn't a gentle silence. It was a violent, predatory void where the hum of life had been just a moment before. The 8 server racks lining the far wall, each a humming monolith of computational power, and the bedrock of my new life, whined down in a chorus of electronic death. The industrial-grade climate control system, the complex network of fans and refrigerant lines that kept my $60,000 processors from melting into slag, ceased its reassuring drone. The only sound was the sudden, frantic thumping of my own heart in the oppressive quiet. A single red light on the uninterruptible power supply blinked once, twice, then went dark. The financial loss was instantaneous and catastrophic. Data streams severed, contracts violated, trust broken. Then, with a guttural roar that shook the concrete floor, the backup diesel generator outside kicked in, flooding the room with the harsh, artificial glare of emergency lighting and the smell of combustion. The system was alive again, but it was on life support, bleeding money with every gallon of fuel. I hung up the phone without a word, my knuckles white. A quick call to the power company confirmed my darkest suspicion. It wasn't a transformer failure or a downed line. It was an administrative hold placed by the Oakwood Creek Homeowners Association, citing a covenant violation for unapproved commercial electrical load. Karen. She had finally done it. She had weaponized a utility, cutting the lifeline not just to my business, but to the promise I had made. In the pulsing silence between the generator's rhythmic roars, I walked with a calm I hadn't felt since my last tour. My steps measured on the polished concrete. I opened the biometric safe built into the wall, its mechanisms clicking open with Swiss precision. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, lay my SIG Sauer P226. I picked it up, the cold, familiar weight a strange comfort in my hand. I slapped a magazine home, the metallic click echoing in the stark room. Then I racked the slide. The sharp, definitive clack of a round being chambered was more than just a sound. It was a decision. It was the sound of a line being crossed, a point of no return. I stood there, staring through the reinforced window at the obscenely perfect, manicured lawns of Oakwood Creek, my mind a cold, clear lake of strategic possibilities. But as my eyes scanned the quiet suburban street, my focus sharpened. It wasn't the local sheriff's department rolling up, lights off, to respond to some panicked call from Karen. It was something else entirely. 2 identical blacked-out Chevrolet Suburbans, their windows tinted to an impenetrable darkness, turned onto my cul-de-sac with a fluid, predatory grace. They moved without haste, but with an undeniable purpose that screamed federal. These weren't cops. These were the kind of vehicles you don't see outside of Quantico or Langley, the kind that meant my carefully compartmentalized past had just violently collided with my fraught present, all because an HOA president with a God complex had pushed one button too many. If you believe that no homeowners association on earth has the right to unilaterally cut off a man's power and threaten his livelihood, then do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. I want to hear from you, so drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from. And if you've got your own HOA nightmare story, share it, because we're all in this fight together. Now let me tell you how this whole mess began, because this was never just about an electrical line or a petty neighborhood dispute. This was about a promise I made to a dying friend on a dusty battlefield half a world away. And it was about a secret buried deep beneath the foundations of this picture-perfect suburb. A secret Karen was about to unwittingly unearth with catastrophic consequences for herself. This story starts not with a violation notice, but with a folded flag. Sergeant First Class Ben Carter was more than just a brother in arms. He was the kind of friend who could read a full situation report in the twitch of your eyebrow. We'd been through the ringer together, from the Hindu Kush to the Horn of Africa. He was a comms guy, a genius with satellites and encryption, while I was the guy on the ground who made sure he had the time and space to work his magic. Our last mission together, a textbook snatch and grab that went sideways, ended with Ben bleeding out in my arms, his last words not of fear or anger, but of his family. "Take care of Sarah and the kids, Jack," he'd whispered, his breath fogging in the cold night air. "And the land, use the land for something good, something smart." He made me promise. I kept that promise. I helped Sarah navigate the labyrinth of military benefits and grief. And when she decided to move back to be with her parents in Ohio, she sold me the 5-acre parcel of land Ben had inherited from his grandfather on the outskirts of Oakwood Creek. It was a strange piece of property, an unincorporated island surrounded by the sprawling, meticulously planned development. Ben had always been fascinated by it. His grandfather had worked for the government back in the Cold War, and the land held a secret. A grandfathered utility easement for a heavy-duty, 3-phase power line that once fed a long, decommissioned Nike missile control site hidden in the nearby hills. For most people, it was a useless anomaly. For me, it was gold. After my medical discharge, I decided to pivot. The physical toll of my career was catching up, but my mind was as sharp as ever. I'd spent 2 decades in special operations, specializing in signals intelligence and cybersecurity. I saw a niche, providing ultra-secure, physically isolated data hosting and network security for clients who couldn't risk their information on a commercial cloud. Defense contractors, financial institutions, even a few discrete government agencies. I drew up the plans, sank every penny of my savings and Ben's life insurance payout into building a state-of-the-art, climate-controlled workshop and data center on that land. It wasn't a pretty building. It was a fortress. A poured concrete box with a Faraday cage built into the walls, its own deep water well, and most importantly, that beautiful, high-amperage power line. I filed all the right permits with the county. Since the land was unincorporated, I wasn't technically part of the Oakwood Creek HOA. I was an island, a sovereign entity, in a sea of beige stucco and perfectly edged lawns. Or so I thought. My first encounter with Karen Brewer, HOA president for life, was 3 weeks after I broke ground. She rolled up in a golf cart that looked more like a miniature tank, its tires barely clearing the top of the grass. She was a large woman, draped in a pastel pink tracksuit that strained at the seams, her face a mask of pleasant, iron-willed condescension. "Mr. Caldwell," she'd announced, not asked, "I'm Karen Brewer, president of the association. We're all just so curious about what you're building here." I explained it was a personal workshop, a place for my hobbies. I kept it vague. I knew people like her. Information was ammunition. "A workshop," she'd scoffed, eyeing the thick concrete walls and the commercial-grade HVAC units being craned into place. "Looks more like an industrial facility. You're aware, of course, that Oakwood Creek has strict covenants regarding commercial enterprises." I politely informed her that my property was not, in fact, part of Oakwood Creek and not subject to her covenants. The pleasant mask flickered. For a split second, I saw the predator underneath. "We'll see about that," she'd chirped, before turning her golf cart around with a vicious squeal of tires and speeding away. That was the first shot in a war I didn't even want to fight. I was just a man trying to honor a promise, to build a new life out of the ashes of an old one, to create something smart and good on a piece of land entrusted to me. But I was about to learn that in the manicured jungles of suburbia, reason is a foreign language and power, no matter how petty, is an all-consuming drug. And Karen Brewer was hopelessly addicted. The escalation began not with a bang, but with a barrage of crisp white envelopes, each delivered with the smug finality of a death sentence. The first was a notice of violation for the color of my mailbox. Apparently, my standard-issue black metal box was not in compliance with the Oakwood Creek approved color palette, which consisted of 27 different shades of beige and taupe. I checked my deed again. My property line was clearly defined, a jagged 5-acre cutout from the sea of HOA jurisdiction. I was not a member. I was not bound by their rules. I wrote a polite, formal letter back to the board, including a copy of my property survey and the relevant county records, explaining the jurisdictional error. I expected that to be the end of it. Instead, I received a second letter a week later. This one assessing a $50 fine for the mailbox, plus a $25 late fee for non-compliance with the first notice. It was signed in a looping, aggressive script by Karen Brewer. It was then I realized I wasn't dealing with a rational actor or a simple bureaucratic mistake. I was dealing with a zealot. This wasn't about a mailbox. It was about sovereignty. My small island of independence was an affront to her absolute rule. I paid the $75. It was a tactical concession, a small price to avoid a protracted, low-level conflict while my much more important project was under construction. I documented the payment, the letters, the absurdity of it all, and filed it away. But weakness, or what is perceived as weakness, only emboldens a predator. My compliance on the mailbox was seen as a crack in the armor. The notices began to arrive weekly. The grass on the undeveloped portion of my property was a quarter-inch too high. A delivery truck for my server equipment had momentarily parked on the public street in a way that disrupted the neighborhood's aesthetic harmony. My security fence, a simple 8-foot chain-link fence topped with privacy slats, well within county code, was deemed industrial and intimidating. The fines piled up, each one more ridiculous than the last. I continued to pay them, my jaw tight with a cold, building anger. I was playing a long game. Every canceled check, every certified letter was another brick in the wall of evidence I was meticulously constructing. My workshop was nearing completion, the sensitive equipment was installed, and I was starting to onboard my first clients. The stress was immense. I was working 18-hour days, managing contractors, configuring complex networks, and all the while fighting this ridiculous shadow war with a suburban tyrant. The turning point came when she demanded an inspection. Another white envelope appeared, this one thicker than the others. It was a formal demand from the Oakwood Creek Architectural Review Committee, chaired by Karen herself, for a full interior and exterior inspection of my outbuilding. They cited a vague covenant about ensuring all structures, even those adjacent to the community, did not pose a safety or nuisance hazard. It was a brilliant piece of bureaucratic overreach, a legal-sounding fiction designed to grant her the one thing she craved: access, a way to finally see what was inside my concrete box, a way to find the ammunition she needed to shut me down for good. This was a line I could not let her cross. My contracts were built on a foundation of absolute security and discretion. The identities of my clients, the nature of the data I was protecting, it was all covered under ironclad non-disclosure agreements. Allowing an unvetted, hostile civilian committee to tour my facility was not just a bad idea, it was a career-ending, potentially life-altering impossibility. I responded with a letter from a lawyer I'd put on retainer, a sharp guy from the city who specialized in property law. The letter was polite but firm, citing state privacy laws, trespassing statutes, and the sensitive, proprietary nature of the work conducted on my property. It stated in no uncertain terms that any attempt to enter my property without a legally binding warrant would be met with appropriate countermeasures. I had hoped the legal language, the letterhead from a downtown law firm, would be enough to make her back down. Instead, it was like throwing gasoline on a fire. Her response wasn't a letter, it was a phone call, the one that ended with my power being cut. She had found a new weapon. She couldn't get inside my fortress, so she was going to starve it from the outside. She had somehow discovered the nature of my work, or at least, she'd made an educated, malicious guess. The high electrical consumption, the security, the secrecy. She'd woven it all into a narrative of a clandestine, power-guzzling, illegal operation. She presented this narrative to the utility company's local compliance office, embellishing it with her official-sounding title of HOA president. She likely cited the same fictional safety and nuisance clause, arguing that my unregistered commercial entity was putting an unsafe strain on the local grid. It was a lie, of course. My connection was a dedicated line separate from the residential grid. But in a world of low-level corporate bureaucrats terrified of liability, her confident, official-sounding complaint was enough. They flagged my account, cut the power, and kicked the problem back to me and the HOA to resolve. And that's how I found myself standing in my darkened workshop, the roar of the generator in my ears, holding a loaded firearm and watching two government SUVs roll silently to a stop in front of my house. The war was no longer about mailboxes and grass length. It had escalated into something far more dangerous. The two Suburbans parked with practiced efficiency, one directly in front of my driveway, the other slightly angled behind it, cutting off any potential exit. The doors opened in near unison, and four men emerged. They were dressed in identical, unassuming civilian attire, dark slacks, polo shirts, light jackets, but they moved with a coordinated economy of motion that was anything but civilian. They didn't fan out or draw weapons. They simply stood, solid and imposing, their eyes scanning everything. The man who emerged from the front passenger seat of the lead vehicle was the one who walked toward my front door. He was of average height and build, but then uninterruptible with thinning hair and a face that was utterly forgettable, which was, I knew, a professional asset. I recognized him instantly. Marcus Thorne. He wasn't exactly a former colleague, but we had orbited the same dark star for years. He was a fixer for one of the more shadowy Beltway contractors, the kind of organization that officially didn't exist, but whose fingerprints were on every major global event of the last 2 decades. My new company had just signed a lucrative contract with them, which is why the sudden unscheduled power outage at my secure facility had triggered alarms not just on my property, but in a windowless room somewhere in Langley, Virginia. I met him on the porch, my own weapon having been safely secured the moment I recognized the vehicles. We didn't shake hands. Men like us didn't need the pleasantries. "Jack," he said, his voice a low, calm baritone, "you've got a power problem." It wasn't a question. "It's being handled, Marcus," I replied, my tone equally level. "It's a local administrative issue." Marcus's eyes, a flat, intelligent gray, swept past me to the workshop, then back. "Our agreement is predicated on 99.999% uptime, Jack. The generator is a fail-safe, not a primary power source. My people are getting nervous when their assets go dark, even for a few seconds. They get even more nervous when the outage isn't an act of tyranny, but an administrative issue." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "So tell me about this administrative issue. Tell me about the Oakwood Creek Homeowners Association." I gave him the condensed version, standing there on my porch in the humid evening air, the generator thrumming a steady, expensive rhythm in the background. I told him about Karen, the fines, the harassment, the demand for an inspection, and her final desperate gambit of pressuring the utility company. I watched his face carefully as I spoke, looking for any sign of dismissal or impatience. I saw none. He listened with an unnerving stillness, his gray eyes fixed on mine, absorbing every detail. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. "She cut the power to a facility safeguarding federally contracted assets," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. It was a simple statement of fact, but it landed with the force of a judge's gavel. "She did," I confirmed, "and in doing so, she has made herself a variable in an equation she doesn't understand." He continued, a slight cold smile touching the corners of his mouth. "And we don't like variables." He turned his head slightly and spoke in a low voice to one of the men standing by the SUV. "Get me a full workup on a Karen Brewer, president of the Oakwood Creek HOA. Financials, political affiliations, digital footprint, family, everything. I want to know what she has for breakfast and who she bribes to ignore her cholesterol count. And get a team from legal on the line. I want to know every single state and federal statute that applies to the willful interference of a utility servicing a government contractor." He turned back to me. "The power will be restored. Jack, that's the easy part. A call from the right person at the Department of Energy to the right vice president at the utility company will clear this administrative hold within the hour." He was right. Less than 45 minutes later, the generator sputtered into silence as the steady, clean power from the grid flooded back into my system. The hum of the servers and the climate control returned, a symphony of normalcy. The immediate crisis was over, but Marcus wasn't finished. "This can't happen again," he said, his voice dropping to an almost conspiratorial whisper. "This woman, this Karen, she's a threat. Not to you, not anymore. She's a threat to my client's operational security. We can't have someone this unstable and this willing to abuse power sitting on the fence line of one of our assets. I felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. I had wanted to fight this battle myself, on my own terms. But Karen, in her spectacular arrogance, had escalated the conflict beyond the borders of Oakwood Creek. She had picked a fight with a homeowner and had ended up poking a multi-billion-dollar national security apparatus in the eye. "What are you proposing?" I asked. Marcus's cold smile returned. "We're not proposing anything. We are going to provide you with resources, intelligence, legal support, strategic advice. You, however, are going to be the tip of the spear. This needs to be her own community that takes her down. It needs to be public, it needs to be legal, and it needs to be decisive. We'll give you the ammunition, Jack, but you have to be the one to pull the trigger." He handed me a simple black business card with nothing but a name and a number on it. "My direct line. You now have the full, albeit discreet, backing of my organization. Use it. Dismantle her little empire. Document,